So, and there's many theological and interdisciplinary initiatives and conferences now devoted to the theme of children and family. And we'll go over a couple, if you'd like, in the bibliography. But I listed here a few of the topics that are studied across the disciplines, not just in ethics. And should I just mention them so we have, for the people not in the room, an understanding of some of these topics? Yeah, well, maybe, like dating, marriage, divorce, remarriage, interfaith marriage. These are issues that we find in the history of the church and today. So all these areas, biblical studies, church history, are looking at some of these subjects of marriage. Or issues of birth, adoption, orphans, orphanages, fatherlessness. That's a huge issue throughout the history of the church, right? Not just today. And so interest across these subjects in those issues. Of course, child-parent relationships, intergenerational relationships, adult responsibilities to children, and children's responsibilities to others, their own agency. Of course, then the classic areas we think of with relation to children, like faith formation, religious education, confirmation, education, those are still interesting, but in all the areas of theology. Rites of passage and worship. And then some of these issues you talked about this morning, like child abuse, domestic violence. You mentioned that case of that 4-year-old dragged in the car seat, and it's actually very haunting for all of us to hear that story. In the news, just before we left to come to South Africa, there was another horrific story of a child in a car seat, and it was the father and mother, apparently, who intentionally left their young child in a car seat in a hot car, and the child died. So it's very haunting when you think about it, isn't it? The vulnerability of children from outside the family, being dragged by people, strangers, but also inside the family. That it was probably the murder of their own child in such a horrific way. So we have this around the world, these issues. Child labor, child soldiers, child slaves, illegitimacy and bastards. It's still something about this issue. It's an ancient issue, an illegitimate child, the bastard, they don't have a legal status, but it's still a kind of an issue today. Children's rights, of course, sexually exploited children, child poverty, children with incarcerated parents, children, with their parents in prison. Then what do? You still want some connection, but they're in prison. Families and addictions, corporal punishment, spanking, that whole issue, that's a big issue across, and child-headed households.